Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I don't know if we're the last dialogue this afternoon, are we?
No, there's a couple after us.
A couple of others. Well, we're clearly the best. So thanks for coming. We wanted to talk a little bit about today about art and investment of passion. So what we thought we would do is we would explore the balance between collecting for passion and collecting for investment. And my name is Claire Marmion. I run an art firm called the Haven Art Group. And I have with me 4 illustrious speakers today. So I'm just going to introduce you to them very quickly, and then we'll get started. First of all, on my right is Heather Becker, who is head of the Conservation Center here in Chicago. They are the official conservators of the fair. And in addition, she is an artist in her own right, too, represented by
Zola Lieberman.
Yeah, exactly. Next, we have Rich Heller, a collector for his sins. And in addition, he's also the chair of the Acquisitions Committee Emerge, which is the council that does acquisitions for emerging artists for the MCA. So he's going to be giving us a perspective on collecting personally and on behalf of an institution today, which is great. Then we have Russell Johnson, who works for Northern Trust, and Northern Trust and Russell's department advises wealthy individuals, wealthy collectors on how to look after their investments. And his specific area of expertise is estate administration too, which is figuring out what to do with all the art, amongst other things, once the family goes through a transition. And then last but not least, we have Robert Wolcott, another collector for his sins. He's also executive director of the Kellogg Innovation Network, and he's also the owner or managing director of Clario Partners. Both. So there we are. Great. Well, good. Let's get started then. I mean, I think, as I said, we want to explore this idea of the balance between collecting for passion and collecting for investment. I wonder how many of you are aware that 10 years ago, if you look at a large institution like Sotheby's, 60% of their collectors were unknown to them 10 years ago. So this is an area that people are beginning to diversify in, both as an asset area, but also continuing to collect just because, frankly, why wouldn't you? Because it's just great fun. So let's kick off with the acquisition part of it. And I'll throw this out to both Rich and Robert, first of all. Can you tell us a little bit about how you both started to collect and how you chose some of your first artists?
Sure, I'll start. So I started collecting before I met my wife, just going to gallery openings. I lived in Chicago, and I was a medical student and then a resident, and it became a very social thing to go to the openings, and I was going primarily for the social aspect of it, and as it turned out, I actually really enjoyed the art. I had had some minor exposure growing up, but certainly nothing in depth. And then I started going to all these openings, and it turned out I really connected with the art, and I didn't expect that. And so that sort of passion, it grew over the years. And by the time I met my wife, I was already starting to collect, at least at a small level, but I was already starting to think about how I wanted to collect.
And how did you hone in on your sort of first acquisition? How did you choose your first artist?
You know, it's a funny story. The artist that got me hooked on art is Jasper Johns. And the first thing I ever bought was a print from Jasper Johns. And I was an intern, and intern at your first year out of medical school, and you don't make a lot of money. And I loved the piece, and it wasn't that expensive, but I couldn't afford to pay for it. And so the gallery said, we know you can pay us off in just a monthly payment plan, and I couldn't afford that. So my grandmother at the time said, I'll pay half, and you pay half. I'll even loan you the half that you can't afford right now. So I had to pay my grandmother off 10-month, which I did. I paid her off in 10-month installments. She gave me interest-free loan, but I paid her off freely, and I actually wrote Johns a letter just telling him how important it was, that I started collecting. The first thing I bought was a Johns, and I actually have a letter from Jasper. He actually wrote me back saying how nice it was to hear that and talking about what he collected.
Gosh, that's fantastic. I'm impressed that he wrote back. What about you, Robert?
Well, so somewhat similar in the sense that it started early in terms of interest, but there was a social aspect to it, doing some gallery walks and things like that. But for a long time, similar to yourself, I was in school, I did a PhD, and then became a faculty member at Kellogg School of Management. And so at the beginning, you know, there isn't that much buying going on, but I started a company in the meantime. And early on, I was inspired by a friend, father, Dick Cooper, who's here in Chicago. It has a fabulous collection that he collected through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and really liked having that, not only the art around, as he does at his office, and we do now at Clario Partners in the West Loop, but also the fact that there were personal relationships with the artists. And for me, that was the thing that encouraged me to buy my first piece, and that was that I consider a serious piece. That was in the mid-2000s. And I remember, this was before I met my now wife, my lovely wife, who sort of keeps me grounded. I remember I'd already had a few pieces. We met, we got married. I bought my first piece after getting married. I was all excited to share it with her. And I put it up on the wall before she got home, and I said, honey, I want to show you something. And she said, what? And I showed her this piece, and I said, isn't it great? And she said, well, it is, but did you think to ask me first? And I said, no, I didn't. I guess that's what it's like to be married. Now, she's very supportive, but that was a learning experience for me. So it was really meeting an artist. He's a local artist named Balthazar Castillo. He's very active. He's at the School of the Art Institute right now. Mid-career change. He's in his, I'm guessing, 50s. And so he started late, but he's quite talented. And I deeply enjoy the personal relationship with the artist.
So can you respond to that, Heather, as an artist? And when different collectors, how do you choose between different collectors that are interested in your work?
Well, I don't think I choose them. I think they choose me. I think having that dialogue is very precious. For example, Buzz Ruttenberg, who is a local Chicago collector, who has collected Nicholas Africano and Giacometti and all of these wonderful artists, and he actually said that he was interested in one of my pieces, and he entered into this very engaging several-week discussion about my work. And that is, I think, very precious from an artist's perspective, to know that the collector is enough of a connoisseur to not only get to know the artist, but the process of an artist and the way they think and how they transition from one body of work to the next body of work, and really how their career has slowly developed over time. And that is really, I think, a sign of a wonderful, very passionate collector. And as an artist, that is the type of collector you want to nurture over several years and enjoy that conversation that continues to go on and on.
But let's talk about money.
Yes.
Well, how does the budgeting for the purchasing fit into that and that relationship?
Well, I think I'm a young emerging artist, so the price of my work is considered, well, fairly low, maybe $4,000 or $5,000. But I think for passionate collectors, I think the interest in the work and the artist comes first, and the price comes secondary. Now then it gets into the finance of all of this, and then all of a sudden it switches to a whole nother channel. But I think if you don't have that immediate visceral connection with the work, it's not going to carry out through your lifetime of collecting. So what do you think about the issue of price?
Pointing at me, right?
Yeah.
I can't tell. Well, from our perspective, our goal is to work with our clients on whatever their investments are. And of course, there's the people who have the stocks and bonds, but there are people who have very diverse assets, including a portfolio of artwork. I would say we don't make art loans, like you think of a mortgage loan or something. We wouldn't just loan to somebody who came off the street, but we do work with our clients within their overall relationship with the bank to figure out a way to help finance what their passion is. In this case, it's art, and how to make sure they have the funds available to do that, and how they can take care of the art, as we're going to talk about later.
Can you guys all hear Russell?
I'm sorry, I'm trying not to shout into the mic.
Yeah, no, eat it up. That's
Eat it
fine.
up,
Just,
okay.
yeah, right in there. So what? Because I know that your firm must do planning too, and as I said, we're seeing increasingly that people are beginning to diversify into this as an asset class.
Right.
How are you seeing that change what you're providing to people in terms of advice and how interested people are, and what sort of budgets are they working with?
Well, there's the client who has the $9 million line of credit that he is able to freely use for whatever he wants. In this case, it happens to be art. And transactions come in and out of the account, so they call us and tell us we're going to be doing something, so we know to watch for that. But we have other clients who just are looking for smaller loans, for a specific piece of art that they're going to buy, and we sit down and we talk with them. And again, we look at the overall relationship and what other assets they have and how this fits into the part that we're helping them with in terms of the overall picture. It's interesting because in 2008, of course, a lot of clients weren't happy with what they were seeing on their paper that came from the bank, because our clients also were all in the market and not doing well after August 2008 in terms of what it looked like, just a year before. But the clients who, in meetings, there were clients who talked about art, and because art was still holding its value, I think, at the same time, and whether they should be getting into that. Although I don't, none of my clients specifically got into it, but we had other clients who already had the art, and it was interesting because they started to understand almost the hedge that provided against the market, because the art doesn't necessarily move in value the same as the market. The art moves on a completely different set of criteria, and so it makes it very interesting to look at their overall assets and realize, well, maybe you're down here, but this is way up and something you should keep pursuing or at least hold on to.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, I was lucky enough to meet with a big collector down in Miami at another insignificant art fair that we won't mention, and she said to me, "My house in Miami is going down on a daily basis in value, but I can take my art collection and I can sell it in any currency in any country in the world." Do you think that is, in fact, driving a lot of this new interest that we're seeing and in the market, and how prices are, as you said, taking a different track?
I think so. I think it's also, it seems sometimes that it's very specific to the genre of art, where the money coming out of Russia, the money coming out of Asia, so those people are specifically driving up values for what they're looking for. So, but I do think there's people who are thinking, I'm going to take my money out of the market. I can't trust the market anymore, and I'm going to park it in other assets, whether it's gold or houses, or because they're cheap, or artwork, and see if I can do better, because the market, has kind of left me in the dust here.
All right. Well, let's switch gears a bit and switch back to you two, Rich and Rob. You mentioned your first acquisition as a Jasper Johns. Could we perhaps talk a little bit about how you then decided what might be a good investment and or art piece after that?
Sure. So, after the Johns, I became more interested, and I think I got some very good advice, which I was lucky enough to take, which was, before you start buying and trying to build your collection, do the legwork and actually, go to a lot of galleries, go to a lot of museums, learn a lot before you actually need to start buying. And so I actually did that. So I spent a lot of time going to gallery openings, going to more, and going to museums and reading a lot, and sort of figuring out what else I like beyond just Jasper Johns. And then I started collecting, and my wife and I started buying works by Barbara Kruger, by Jenny Holzer, by Glenn Ligon, and then we looked back and after having bought them, because we bought what we liked, and realized that we had a natural affinity for text-based work, conceptual artists, and that was not intentional, and then we sort of defined the collection after we bought a few pieces.
Do you mind if I throw up the image of, you've given me an image of a Glenn Ligon here, haven't you?
So that's a wonderful piece by Glenn, who many of you may know, some of you may not. A mid-career artist from New York, whose most famous images are similar to this, where he appropriates text from various sources and then paints them or has them on, works on paper and canvas.
So I've got this one as, I feel most coloured when I'm against a sharp white background. Roughly what date is this, Rich?
This might be from, I think, he did a series in this from the 90s.
Yeah,
and this,
about 1990, is it?
Yeah, this would be from the 90s, and it's absolutely fantastic. There are paintings and prints from these. And these images, I think the prints were included in his Whitney retrospective in the last couple of years. But getting back to what you were saying about hedges, we started buying Glenn several years ago, and his market has since changed, but that was before 2008. And so when 2008 came, and our equity investment, the market, and our home investment had all gone down, we had an unintentional hedge by diversifying into art. And so our overall portfolio, while down, was certainly hedged, not intentionally so, but was certainly hedged by investing in art, among them Glenn, but certainly that was an unintentional benefit of the diversification of our portfolio.
So how did you, obviously you did a bit of research to find him, but when you came to that critical buying decision?
Now we're getting into stalking territory. So I'd read about Glenn, and I had seen works by Glenn. But Glenn is very fickle, and at the time didn't have a New York gallery, and his work was hard to come by. So I literally, and this is true, started stalking him. He was in Miami, he was in that other fair, I met him there. And then I was in New York one time, and I had a list of every gallery he'd ever shown at. And I went to every single gallery he'd ever shown at and knocked on their door. Hi, I remember Glenn Lagan. I used to show him a few years ago. Do you have any work? And they're like, no. And then one of them was like, yeah, I hate the guy. I got a bunch of stuff. You can buy all of it. So he had it in storage at his facility in upstate New York. So my wife and I took the train to upstate New York to go to their storage facility and see what they had from Glenn. And we bought everything we could afford.
And did you have any idea what sort of price it would be at the point at which you were in your stalker mode?
Yeah, he was not that expensive at the time. I mean, he was not cheap, but he was certainly not what he is today. And so I bought everything that I could afford. I was absolutely thought he was, I thought he was absolutely fantastic and was obsessed.
So you, at this stage, you're early on, you had no vision of the cohesiveness of a collection or how much you would budget. You just saw something you really liked and you went after it.
Glenn, with our purchases of Glenn, it started to gel the collection as a vision, because by that point we already had works by Barbara Kruger and Jenny Holzer, and then when we realized that we loved Glenn, that's what the light bulb went off, that hey, this is what we're really connecting with is conceptual text-based work. Glenn is the embodiment of that. That's why we're falling in love with Glenn. And so that's when we became passionate, to say the least.
What about you, Robert?
Well, so I'll qualify this by saying the legwork you talked about, the study, the research, all the hard work. Well, I haven't done that for the most part. Why do I say that? Well, in my business, in my job, so I'm a professor at Kellogg, as I mentioned, and I have a firm called Clario Partners. And our core business is strategy. We work for BP and Kraft and ITW and large companies. But my partners and I also make investments. We make investments in early stage companies. We're angel investors. So we invested in this fair, I'm happy to say. Very excited about this. This is very important for the city. Thanks, Joel and Tony and everybody. We invested in Indiegogo, which is the second largest crowdfunding site. Great idea. We spent a lot of time investigating, interviewing the management, doing all the things you do as an angel investor. With art, I don't do that. And that's not because it's smart. Don't take me as a cue. Instead, I find art, usually here in Chicago, though not always, that I love, that I respond to, that I'm very interested in. I think we have one or two pictures later, you can get a sense. And
Which
I get
one?
to know the artist.
Which one do you want me to
And
throw
that,
up?
throw the Wesley, because they can go and see a piece here, the Kimmler.
Let's do that.
So these are two pieces by Wesley Kimmler, and many of you here in Chicago would know Wesley. He's Wesley. Good, all the good and bad, all the wonderful and difficult.
What does that mean?
Well, if you know Wesley, he's very opinionated, and I like that about him. But there are a number of things that I love about Wesley. He's an old-time artist in the sense of having technical skill, an exceptional amount of technical skill. Also a lot of vision and concept with what he does at the same time. So he brings skill and concept together. And he also is widely read. He's an erudite guy. He can quote from poetry. He can take from history. In fact, these two pieces, I own the one here on the left, and I apologize, it's kind of bad lighting on the picture, but and this piece on the right is actually here at the fair. You can find it. I think it's called Five Sisters. But they're both from the same series, and they both take cues from the war in the Pacific, World War II in the Pacific. These are actual stories of individuals and their experiences in World War II. And then he's taken his form. You can see his work in a lot of places in Chicago. There's sort of amoebic form from which faces and other concepts arise. So I think for me, it is about the investment. I think at some point in the future, I have faith that something that I'm collecting will turn out well. My business is all about making smart investments, so I don't want to spend a lot of time doing that in my art. I want things I love from people whom I respect, who have committed their lives to being artists.
So this one is, if I'm right, is this, the title of this one is Hillbilly Abyss?
That's
the
right.
one that you own on the left.
That's right, yeah.
And what What was it about it that you just fell in love with?
Well, I think so. The story briefly is this gentleman on the right is falling in war, as you might guess, and he's on an island in the Pacific, and you can see the complexity and the horrible milieu he was in at the time. And this woman, I imagine, is reflective of something that's going through his head as he falls in war. And this other figure here is the physician, the doctor that is attempting to save his life, and that didn't happen. But he's a real individual. He's an individual that was from the Appalachian Mountains. He was a young fellow who became famous because he was a musician as well, so he played for the troops a lot, and he fell in battle. So what resonated with me was the power and you can't see it here in this photo, but the power and the intensity, the color, and the emotional reality that it provides to me.
And I think what's interesting about what they're both saying is, actually, you really kind of have the same passion. Maybe yours isn't described the same way, and I think that's what drives this investment, and maybe that's what we see with our clients sometimes who don't have art, is they understand it's not something you can just turn on Mad Money and see what Jim Cramer's saying is the best Monet to buy this week. You actually have to get out there and visit the galleries and know the artists and learn what is the best representation of their work, and you start to appreciate it, and then are willing to put the money into it in the hope that someday this is going to pay off. But if nothing else, you love it and you like looking at it in your living room or wherever it's hanging. So.
And just to add to that, I think the important thing to note here is that not only is it an asset class that's doing well, this is something you could spend your entire life enjoying and doing and learning about and developing over a long period of time. So not only does it have a financial plus, but it also has just a lifestyle to it that is incredibly enjoyable and fun. So I think that's a lot of what we're talking about.
It is fun. Can I throw up this fun Jeff Koons image then? Rich, will you tell us about this?
Sure. So the image you're going to put up is of a CAT scan machine. I'm a radiologist specializing in children's imaging. And several years ago, my wife and I read about a wonderful charity called RX Art out of New York, run by Diane Brown, who was a former gallerist. And she founded this charity to put contemporary art in hospitals around the country. And this was their first piece to be done in the Midwest. And the museum had gotten to a point where they felt they were big enough to reach out to Jeff. And so Jeff is absolutely committed to children and children's charities. And so when Jeff heard about this, he said, I'd love to do it. I've got a lot on my plate, but let's figure out a great way to do it. And he followed through. And as you can see, absolutely gorgeous. That's our CAT scan machine. And at least you can see a little bit of the walls. So all of the walls around it were images of his paintings and sculpture. And then he actually had the whole CAT scan machine himself designed with his images. Absolutely gorgeous. And the children absolutely love it.
And it's been so successful you're doing a second series, aren't you?
When Jeff came for the opening, he was blown away by how beautiful the installation actually was. He had designed it, but he hadn't seen it in real life. And so when he saw how neat it was in real life and the impact it was going to have, he said, can we do another room? And we said, yeah, yes, please. And he said, well, where do we think we should go? And then we toured him around the hospital, and he liked the idea of doing a room where the children are sedated. So many of the children that have to be examined require sedation so they don't move during the studies. And that's where they sort of wait, and there's a lot of anxiety associated with that, both from the parents as well as the children. And so Jeff's like, well, that would be a wonderful room to do it, because there's so much anxiety and stress around this room. What a wonderful place if we can try and alleviate some of that.
That's lovely.
And he was I can't say enough good things about how brilliant he was to work with, how incredibly committed he was to the project and to children's charities around the world.
That's brilliant. Thank you. That's brilliant. Well, let's talk a bit. I want to talk a bit now about the role of custodian if you're a collector, because hopefully these things will long outlast us all. And I want to talk a little bit about what it is to maintain the value and what's required of that, because I don't think a lot of, would you say it's fair to say that I don't think a lot of collectors spend a lot of time thinking about what's required to maintain a collection and maintain that asset value? And for me, I think this is extraordinary, because you wouldn't dream of owning a $3 million house and not checking the HVAC once a year and clearing out the gutters and making sure that your grounds are properly graded. And yet, somehow, there seems to be a style amongst collectors where they will put the collection up and think that no money needs to be spent on it. And particularly, I want to talk about this with you guys with regard to contemporary art, because condition of contemporary art is so critical. What do you two or you four, what have you all done about any sort of budget to maintain any collections? Throw up an image of.
I mean, I can certainly say at least one thing. We're talking about that Glen work, is
Yeah.
that you make accommodations. For example, we have 2 young children, and we have several works that are not meant to be framed or protected. They should be out in the open. And I said, that's wonderful to hear that. I appreciate that. It's framed and protected. The reality is that you can tell my 6-year-old and 3-year-old you can't touch art, and they're very respectful, but God forbid a sippy cup gets thrown and hits the work. So, we're very careful about trying to protect everything for that very reason, even if it, somewhat is not what the gallery would have liked.
What do you, apart from children aside, what do you perceive as the main exposures to the collection if it's hanging in your house?
Well, you always worry about sun damage,
Yeah.
where you're going to be installing pieces, and water damage, absolutely. Yeah, no, water damage, and can it be hit accidentally? Is it in a position, for example, I think you had a Rashid Johnson up, which has these shelves that come out. We have a Rashid, what you can see is that looks like a bar is actually a shelf that comes out, and it's got objects on it. And so, we have a Rashid Johnson, which is not in our home right now, but where placement is important because you don't want somebody actually walking around and accidentally knocking into it. And so we take those ideas into account when placing things in the home.
The thing that we often talk with clients about is insurance. Clients, maybe forget that they need to have more than just your standard homeowner's policy. Some of this stuff needs to be separately scheduled. Some of it needs to be appraised on a somewhat regular basis so you can tell your insurer the changes in value. I had someone today from the banking department talk to me about a client who had something he paid $100,000 for, and a dealer called him a couple of months ago and said, well, I'll buy it back from you for about $700,000. And the first question the banker said, well, what do you have it insured for? Were you even aware that the value had changed that much? So that's a key concern, because if something does happen like water damage or, God forbid, the sippy cup or something, you need to figure out, or is there any way you're going to get any of your money back for that work, or at least to get it repaired and do something.
Yeah, to add to that point, I think it's important for you all to always inquire with your broker about the underwriting of your policy and the type of policy that you have, because there's so many exclusions as well. For example, with all of the flooding that's occurred over the last couple of years, there's so many policies that exclude mold, and a lot of people just don't even realize that. So I think it's important to be inquisitive with your insurance and your broker and really understand the types of coverages that you have. Yeah.
I agree. What about proactive? What about preventative measures? Anyone? Do you guys have a kind of formal framework, or do you just sort of, is it something that you think about?
Well, preventative, I mean, the mention was made of water damage. In our building in the West Loop, it's a very old building. It's over 100 years old, and there are some water stacks in the building. In our space, there are 3. So we don't hang anything within shouting distance of those 3 stacks, because we've had 2 experiences where we've had somebody's hot water heater, blows up, and try and go to your insurance company and just have a conversation about that. Just keep it away, Put some other sort of garbage there, and you're not worried about. So that's preventative. But 2, the other thing that I do and this is where I feel somewhat privileged, is having artists here in Chicago whom I respect, and we have built this relationship. I ask them to come over from time to time, or they just come over, and they'll make a comment, or they'll say, Wesley said one time, I'm going to come over and clean this thing up because it's got a lot of dust on it. I said, fine, fair enough, and he didn't send me a bill. So I take, to some extent, I take the artist's recommendations for what to do and how to behave. I do have insurance on the art, but I have not tied it down appropriately. I really have no idea what the current value is. I know what it was valued at when it was insured, but maybe you and I should talk.
Well, no, you make a good point, because of course gradual deterioration or some sort of surface cleaning, that's not the sort of thing that you can insure for. So I think insurance is a great point, and I think people have the perception that a lot of damage occurs in transit, which it absolutely does, and we should talk about that. But in addition, the perils within your own home, and a work of art is much more likely, just so you know, to be the subject of fire or flood, and actually one of the most common causes of loss in the home for art collectors is accidental damage, and it's either usually a member of the family interacting, should I say, with the work of art accidentally, or actually the hardware. A lot of people will put pieces up on hardware that they then don't change out for 5, 10, 15 years, and it literally just falls off the wall one day. People think it's never gonna happen because it's not something that's visible to them, but you've got to be very vigilant about making sure that the sort of protection or immediate environment around the piece is as it should be. Can I, I'm dying to throw up your Matisse, Heather. Can I
sure.
show that?
Absolutely, but I wanted to follow up to one of your comments about UV protection. As a conservator, we see this issue time and time again. We'll go into a home and move a bunch of art, and you'll take the piece of art down, and you'll see that the size of the piece of art, the wall behind it, has faded because, around the piece, and you can see that the paint is actually darker behind the piece because that is the amount of fading that has occurred to the piece if there's no UV protection. And I think people that live in these beautiful condos with all this wonderful sunlight, it is so great to have a modern home with modern art up on the wall and a beautiful contemporary environment, but that kind of light exposure can be so detrimental. So there are great products out there made by 3M and several others where there's UV filtering plexi and glass, and it deters about 97% of the harmful rays. And there's also filtering that can go on your windows that you can barely detect to, and that's a great product as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. The standard UV filters are about 30, but if you get a specialized product, which is very, very cheap, the filters are between 95 and 97%, which is really what you want. And Heather's absolutely right. You want it on the windows and on the piece as well. And we're, of course, talking about works on paper because they're particularly susceptible to fading. So photographs, but also drawings, prints.
I had an estate in which the decedent left some pieces to the museum, and the museum came over to look at it. And first of all, the decedent was a heavy smoker, which impacts everything in your home. And then we think what happened, because when the museum took it off the wall, they couldn't figure out why the surface of it looked so odd, and they think what happened was the house cleaner, in an attempt to try to clean it, had put lemon pledge on a sponge and sort of tried to wipe it off. Yeah. So it wasn't because she was trying to ruin it, she just didn't know any better. Sort of like the woman who tried to touch up the thing in Spain that last month we all read about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very true. Tell us about this Matisse.
Yes, this is actually a Matisse that was bought by a local collector, and it was bought at auction, and it was shipped, and unfortunately it was behind glass, and the glass was not removed or taped before it was shipped. So it ended up with about 12 different holes, and the hinges failed because when the glass broke and it was shuffling around in the crate as it was being moved by the art handlers, the hinges gave as well, and that's what caused the major deformations in the surface. So not only do you have an issue of the tear repairs, but that you also have the deformation in the surface to deal with. So unfortunately, a piece like this that was pristine at the time of the sale, which this is a real tragedy, and it would have been something so easy to prevent if the shippers and art handlers were really being careful. So you as a collector, I think it's important to always ask these questions. How is it going to be shipped? Who's doing it? How experienced are they? And this was really unfortunate. Now the collector loved the piece.
Heather,
yes.
sorry to interrupt. Just to be clear, this is because they didn't either tape the glass or remove the glass.
Correct.
They just shipped it with the glass on, just that simple. Okay,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, and the collector decided he wanted to keep it. He liked the image so much. He said, do whatever you can do. So the thing that is important for you all to know is the value will never be the same. It's gone down in value about 50%, because once something has been permanently altered structurally, whether it's tears in a canvas or holes in a work of art on paper like this, there's a permanent loss of value. You will never be able to have the piece back to a pristine state. So this is an unfortunate example that could have been prevented.
Were you privy to the insurance values before and after?
Yes, we were. Yeah, this has dropped about 50%.
And
But you're not allowed to tell us where it started.
No, I'm not. Sorry. It's a confidentiality issue.
That's
so.
okay.
But at the bank, when we're handling decedent's assets and we need to ship things, we do worry about the movers, because you can't just have any mover. You can't do this on price. You need to do this with a mover who has worked with artwork before. And we tend to ask, the local museums who they use, or the auction houses, because we figure they've already vetted these people. They must know what they're doing. And so we want to make sure that things like this don't happen, that just anybody takes it and tries to move it.
Should we also, should we touch briefly, Heather, on lending? Because we were having an interesting discussion the other day about gradual deterioration, and I think this is something that's interesting for people to hear, because particularly collectors are interested in lending pieces in order to improve the provenance and therefore the value of the piece. But you've got quite a lot of experience of seeing works come and go and what happens to them over time if they're lent very actively to different exhibitions, haven't you?
Yeah, well, the artist side of me says, art is made for all of us to enjoy. It's made for all of us. It's not made to be in a private home tucked away and none of us ever see it. I think lending is very important for a collector, and I think it's important to encourage that, especially major shows for an artist at a museum. But I would do it with caution, and do it with education and awareness, and making sure that you are asking all of the right questions. Because what we see time and again with lending is the piece is not looked at by a conservator before it leaves. The collector is not maybe privy to some of the nuances of the condition issues that might be subtly getting a little bit worse over time. So let me give you an example. A collector who buys works in South America, and they're very fragile paint layers, and they're shipped to major institutional shows all around the world, and the frames and the pieces are very delicate. So there's one or two that she has decided to just not lend anymore because they have slowly deteriorated because of the amount of shows that they have been in. And that's sad to hear. But that kind of thing can be prevented if you're constantly asking these questions. Who's the handler? Is the institution covering these things and preventing any potential damage from occurring?
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Well, I think chaps and lady, we should move on to sort of the final phase, if you like, of the life cycle of a work of art. If you've done your job as a custodian and you've looked after it, and now you're getting into the phase where you've got to think about what's going to happen to the work of art after you're gone. Perhaps we could, yeah. Well, of course. Well, Russell, why don't you? Do you want to start off by telling people what empty hook syndrome is?
Empty hook syndrome is when someone dies and the children immediately go in the house, for instance, and take everything off the wall and take it to their house. And so when you go into the decedent's house, all that you see is empty hooks.
How shocking. I've never seen that before.
That is my worst nightmare, because we try to explain to the clients, in the United States, we have to pay an estate tax. In the state of Illinois, we have to pay an estate tax. We need to have everything appraised. Please do not remove things from the house. And sometimes it's perfectly innocent, because the decedent has been saying their entire life, I want this to go to you when I die. So the kids think, oh, I can just take it. But you really should not do that. One, because I have to have it valued. Two, because you can't, some of these things you can't just throw in the back of your SUV and drive home. They need to be packed. And if it's damaged, I have no idea whether that damage happened before the person died or the family member has damaged it. Of course, they're not going to own up to that because they could have impacted the value. So it's something that we do see. That's why someone dies, we'll try to go in immediately and change locks and make sure everything's secured until we have gotten our appraisal or our inventory done, so that we know everything that's in the house and can deal with it accordingly, according to the estate plan that the decedent should have left behind.
Now, surely you must work with collectors that have a certain degree of reticence to have an appraisal.
Oh, yes.
After
Well, first of all, they don't want to pay for it because, it's not like a real estate appraisal where it's $300. You may pay a couple of $1,000s or more to have your work appraised, but it's completely worth it because you're going to have a nice summary book that tells you exactly what it's worth. It can be an appraisal if it's for certain purposes, can be used for insurance, or otherwise, of course, we're going to use it for estate tax if it's as of date of death. So, yeah, there are those, and there are clients who I think realize there's an estate tax, and so they are trying to take the art away. It's interesting because there was an article in the Huffington Post about 2 years ago about Giacometti, I think Giacometti had just, a piece had sold for maybe $104 million at auction. It was a record price, and the person who wrote this article was talking about the client he interacted with. He was a dealer at the time, and the Giacometti in this story originally had been bought by the grandparents in the 1930s on their honeymoon. And so they just bought it because it was an interesting piece of work. They had no idea this was going to take off as an artist. And the son, who went to college and took art appreciation, realized 20, 30 years later, oh, that's a very valuable statue sitting on the den with a bunch of books around it. And he told his parents, and they thought, oh, that's nice. But to them, it was their honeymoon reminder. That's all it was. Well, when parents die, or grandparents in this case, the son took the piece of work away because he didn't know he was going to inherit. And so he kept it for about 20, 30 years till he died. Well, his son, knowing the value, then again took it out of the house before it was appraised or put onto any inventory or estate tax return. But the grandson, the one who ended up with eventually, he didn't want to keep it. He had other lifestyle requests, I guess, that he wanted to fund, and so he wanted to sell it. So he took it into the auction house. And of course, the first problem you have is provenance. How can you prove that you own this piece of work? And this is the thing that auction houses are always worried about. They don't want to be selling something and have a bunch of people show up and claim this was taken from me during the war, or this is something that was stolen from me, and you should not be selling it. But the other thing, of course, is there's estate tax fraud that's gone on here. And in this case, when the auction house put it in their book, they were going to sell it. They were thinking this, maybe a $10 million was what they were going to end up with. The IRS, interestingly enough, reads the auction manuals and looks through them. And, if you read them, and a lot of times they'll say from the estate of, and in this case, I think they had all the different estates because they really weren't aware that this was a problem. And the agent came in and did his research, there was 2 estates they hadn't paid estate tax on. So there was a huge, huge estate tax bill because the statute doesn't run if you don't declare. There's no statute of limitations. And it cost him quite a bit of money. Plus, he got put in prison for tax fraud. It's a nice little perk for the whole thing.
So there's no statute of limitations at all?
No.
So just
if you don't put it on the return, right, if you don't disclose it, right.
So just to be clear, if you're grandma and you have a wonderful Giacometti or a wonderful Picasso, and you never insure it, and you go to a great deal of trouble to keep it off your financial records, and then it passes to your son,
right,
and then he passes it to his son, who needs to sell it because his son has got a place at Northwestern or Harvard or Stanford.
Yeah.
At the point of sale, 50 or 60 years of back taxes are going to be owed.
Oh, yes.
Right.
And again, I'm not saying that the IRS catches all of these, but they're obviously looking, and you're taking a big gamble, and one that could end up having you bunk with somebody named Bubba or something. So
what am I missing here? What's the point in hiding it if you can't ever sell it?
The original purpose of hiding it is because they don't want to pay the estate tax. The U.S. estate tax rate right now is 35%. Many of you probably heard January 1, the rates are going to go up to 55%. The exemption, there's a $5 million exemption right now that you can use for gifting, which we have a lot of clients at Northern Trust who are doing a lot of transactions here at the end of the year to try to take advantage of that because the exemption drops to $1 million. So your rate goes up and your exemption goes down January 1. So it's something that all our clients are worried about and that we talk with them about. So what they're trying to do is save some tax. And sometimes it works, but if you get caught with the penalties and interest, you can end up in a much, much worse situation than if you'd just gone ahead and been honest with the IRS about it.
Rich and Robert, have you done any planning yet?
Oh, go ahead.
Don't all jump at once.
No, and now I'm feeling horrible. Yes, when we had our conference call, I remember telling my wife that we are awful, and I was taking vigorous notes from Russell about everything he was saying and all the pearls he was spitting out that we need to do that too. We need to do that too. It's funny, as a big of a percentage of our overall portfolio as our art collection is, we've done estate planning for our children in case of, God forbid anything happens, but we haven't specified the art. We have everything. The children have trusts and everything like that, and life insurance policies and everything set up, but we hadn't specifically dealt with the art. And it wasn't until Russell pointed out, that's a decent percentage of your investment. Maybe you want to deal with that. Oh yeah, no, you're right. And so I suspect that I'm not the only collector who hasn't thought of that.
Have either of you been approached by what about not planning for sale or bequests? Have you been approached by any museums or institutions with regard to any donations or gifting yet? Because that's another way, of course, the art can pass.
No, we have. And we have a very standard answer, which is that, we're very involved with the MCA here. And we simply say that, right now we're focusing on building the collection and that we will talk about at some point the eventuality, but we're just not at that point where we want to have that conversation yet. That we really still see ourselves as being on an upsweep. And you can make the point that, yes, you should always plan for the eventuality, which is not an unreasonable thing to say, but we're really at a point where we're really focusing for right now on trying to build the collection.
Do you have any advice, Russell, for people who are thinking about gifting or donating?
Well, this is again a topic that we have with clients all the time. What are your objectives? What do you own? That's always a tough question sometimes because they don't think of the art as an investment. A lot of them, it's a passion, it's a personal property item, and they forget that they need to put this down and be talking to their estate planner, talking to their financial advisor about it. What do you own? What is its value? What are your objectives? Where do you want this to go? Logically, you think if they have kids, they want to give it to the kids. But the kids aren't always collectors. The kids may not have an interest. Someone was telling me about their client who the kids almost resented the art because they had so much of it that growing up they felt like they lived in a museum. They didn't live in a home because you can't touch the art. I'm not saying this wasn't Rich. He didn't tell me this story. But so, there may be a situation where you think the kids want it, but the kids don't. You may have a collection that you want to keep together. So you don't want it to be broken up into pieces or sold, God forbid, to pay the estate tax. So you have to do the planning. Maybe you want it to go to a museum. But the thing that I always find interesting is when you talk to the museums, they will tell you, oh yeah, we get calls all the time that so-and-so wants to give me art or left us art in the will. But they don't take all the art. They're not a warehouse. Museums have a purpose. They have their collection that they regularly update and have a focus on. And so just because they have 10 works by that artist doesn't mean they want yours. Or if they're a small museum, they may not be able to take your collection because they don't have the money. And if you're not going to give them an endowment to help them maintain that, they're just going to turn it down. Or the classic one is the person who says, I want it continuously displayed for all purposes. Well, the museums aren't going to commit to that either. They like to move things around and do different projects. So we encourage the clients who want to do planning and involve gifting to a museum that they have that conversation up front. Someone was just telling me last week that he's going to be meeting with the Art Institute about 3 paintings the client owns to find out, well, does the Art Institute, are they really interested? And it's not because you have bad art or because you've done anything wrong. It's just that they have their own mission and objective they're trying to satisfy, and they just can't take everybody's art. So it's something to really be talking about with your estate planner, to talk with your financial advisor, first of all, that you have this asset and different ways that you can get it to the museum, as well as talking to the museum itself to make sure, do you want to have a special room set aside? Do you want to have your name displayed? All those kind of things that need to enter into the conversation before the moment of death when you can't turn things around.
Robert, did you have something to add?
Well, I'll make a bit of an admission. We've spent a lot of time with respect to the company. So our major asset as a company, and as you know, when someone dies, especially if it's unexpectedly, that can cause horrible problems because then who wants to buy a company fire sale sort of to pay the estate tax? And to be honest, we haven't really thought much about the art. And that has a lot to do with the reasons I'm doing, the passion, the interest, the support for artists and all that, but we haven't really thought about it, and we should. So there you go.
I think we've got a little pattern here that the more knowledge you have about collection care and the concerns related to that are advantageous to the collector. The more you know about your insurance policies and what they actually mean and what all that crazy language is actually saying, and then also to the estate planning. Really starting to investigate that, and the more you learn about all of the little loopholes of all of those issues legally and financially, and also with what you're particularly looking for, I think that level of investigation is really at the root of what we're saying here, isn't it?
It's very interesting when you think about kids particularly, isn't it? Because you could see a family where you had, say, 3 kids, and you've got 3 major pieces of art in the collection, but they've all appreciated at very different rates. And they may love them all equally, but there's nothing that would cause an argument like one of the kids being left the piece that was twice the value of the other.
We had an estate in which the decedent had several major works, including 2 Monets. And she decided to, break it up, and she had 2 children, 2 daughters, and she gave each daughter a Monet. Well, one of them appraised out at $1 million, and one appraised out at $7 million. Now, luckily, these daughters got along, so this wasn't they knew this is what mother wanted. They didn't regard this as some kind of a opinion on them from their mother. But in a bad family situation, that's the kind of stuff you end up in litigation on. So,
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, listen, we're nearly out of time, so let's throw it open to questions from the floor. Will one of you chaps, would you mind very much handing down the... Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi. I had 2 questions. First one was for a new collector like myself. I was wondering what advice you'd give at a fair like this, where a jump-in point would be. I know there's a lot of really pricey stuff here, but if you had any advice on what particular things or what level or any certain artists that you might have. And the other question is, we haven't talked about disposition apart from the estate problems. I mean, just when you're tired of a piece or you want to go into a different work of art, what's the best way to actually sell the piece and get the most money for it?
Robert and Rich, do you want to take that one?
you start, give the mic.
I'll start because I have the mic. So I'll take the first question first. It's a question that I'm actually asked not that infrequently, and the advice that I tend to give is this: first of all, the fair is a great place to start, for sure, because you're going to expose yourself to a huge variety of artists and a huge spectrum of price ranges. And so what I would say is find artists that you like, and that often, even if you can't afford that painting by that artist, they may have addition to work which is less expensive. They may have smaller works on paper, which are very similar to the larger work, but certainly at a much more affordable price. In fact, I often encourage people that want to get into collecting that I say that prints are a wonderful way to get into collecting art because it exposes you to a wide variety of art. It's got a much lower price point, and the reality is if you don't like it, it's got a very liquid market. That prints are there's constantly being traded. It's actually a reasonable investment. In fact, I was looking this up, and it was interesting because I'm interested in Warhol. In the decade from 2000 to 2010, the Warhol print market outdid the Warhol painting market. So the prints, are very reasonable, investment on their own, and it's an easier way to get involved at a lower price point.
And wouldn't you say that the gallery is an important part of that too? I mean, I think this is a great sort of venue for them to showcase, but then you begin to build a relationship with them and find out what sort of access they have to different stock or different items.
Absolutely, and a lot of it is about relationships. So you may say, I really like this artist, and they may say the painting's this much. Well, I can afford this much, but we have this work on paper. Well, then you buy that work on paper, and then years later, you may buy the second work on paper, and then you may build yourself up. And it also goes the other way, that they may not want to sell somebody a major painting that doesn't have that work. And so I can think of at least one artist that we collect where they wouldn't sell us a painting early on, regardless of whether we could afford it or not. And so they sold us photographs, and we built up a collection big enough that they saw us, and they're like, they would let you have a painting now. So they literally had to build ourselves up.
Right, and the same is true of art advisors, presumably. If you're working with an art advisor, they have that relationship that you can leverage with a gallery for acquisitions. Yes, Robert?
Yeah, so I would add, first I agree, and whatever you decide you love, and for God's sake, don't buy stuff you don't love unless you're only in it for the money, and that's a whole different thing. You got to ask somebody else if that's the case. But buy the best quality of whatever it is that you can afford that you love. But the second thing is find somebody who's already sort of in the game. That could be a gallery owner, it could be an artist, it could be a collector, a consultant, somebody hopefully in the area as well, in the Chicago area if you live here, and get to know them a bit and learn from them, because there are going to be a lot of moments where you're not really sure. That anxiety, I remember the first time, maybe the second time I bought a piece, and I was standing there thinking, is this really the right piece? Is the right price? How do I know? Well, I didn't have anybody to talk to. I do now. I've got lots of people to talk to. So I would go out and find somebody. And the third piece of advice, why are you doing it? What are your objectives? Absolutely be clear with yourself. So first and foremost, it's an investment. Second, it's because I love it. Or maybe it's vice versa. Maybe I love it, then it's an investment. Another potential objective is, frankly, I want to support artists. I want to support people in the Chicago community who are committing their lives full-time or as close to it as possible to enriching all of us. And that's an objective too. So decide what your primary hierarchy of objectives are. Find a mentor or someone you can trust, and then buy the best you can afford.
And the disposition part of the question?
I haven't disposed anything.
Well, for us, for the estates, it's usually through the auction houses because we're under a duty to get the best price, and we feel that exposes it to the market. Although earlier I talked about the example of the person who had the dealer call them who had sold them the painting and wanted to buy it back for a much higher price. So that maybe is a conversation you have with your dealer, particularly if you do a lot of work with them. They may be willing to take the work back in if they think they can find another buyer. I've seen client notes on art where they swapped paintings and said, well, I'm going to give you these two back because I want that one. And the dealer said, sure, because they felt they could resell those two paintings and work it all out.
I want to add something. So I study technology and innovation and all that, and I'm going to make a prediction here today. A lot of the online marketplaces for art are still early and clunky, and maybe prints. There's some activity in prints that's useful, and you get some benchmarks and a little bit more transparency. But I bet you in 5 to 10 years, especially, there's going to be a lot more going on in the online space. The dealers will still be important. The relationship between artists and dealers, et cetera, will still be important, but you're going to get a lot more information, a lot more transparency over the next decade from the online space.
Thank you. Okay, who's next? Other questions? Yes, at the back there. Thank you.
I'm interested in more photography, and I've noticed there's a lot of drawings and other pieces out there. How do they appreciate it, and how do they stack up in value if you buy sort of like a Gordon Parks type of photograph?
Well, I can tell you that the contemporary photography, you're speaking of contemporary photography, that market has really changed a lot in the last decade. In fact, it's interesting, they used to have the separate auctions for the photography auctions, and then they started easing them into the main contemporary fair auctions. And now you'll see, Gursky and Sherman dominating even evening auctions. So I certainly think their market, I think that, photography has certainly, come into its own and is certainly a major thrust of the contemporary art movement. You can't have a conversation without talking about Cindy Sherman and Gursky, these wonderful photographers. And at least for Beth and I, photography is an important part of our collection. For one reason, it's at a lower price point. So if you like these great artists, some of them do paintings, some of them do photography like Marilyn Minter. Well, you know what? We have several photographs by Marilyn Minter. The paintings, at the time, we couldn't even get them. So for us, it's a big part of our collection. And for so many artists, David Wojnarowicz, who do paintings and do photography, photography is a large part of their movement, and it's often at a lower price point because of its multiple nature. And so I think photography is growing and will continue to grow and will continue to become a bigger and bigger part of the market, and as I think it should be.
Yeah, I completely agree. Photography sales, as such, didn't exist maybe 8 or 10 years ago. So now there are entire collections that are made up exclusively of just photography, but they also exist in other collections that are rounded with multiple mediums. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? Good. Well, thank you very much for listening. And give a hand to our... Thank you.